The moment the police opened the doors of the school bus, everything changed. Parents held their breath, children watched in silence, and the quiet street felt suddenly heavy with tension. No one expected the day to unfold this way. What the officers were about to discover inside that bus would leave everyone stunned and questioning everything they thought they knew. It started as an ordinary afternoon outside the school. The final bell had rung, and the yellow school bus was ready to take the children home. Laughter echoed softly as kids settled into their seats, talking about homework, friends, and the small moments that filled their day. The driver checked the mirrors, ready to pull away, when a loud voice suddenly cut through the calm. Karen had arrived. She stood near the bus, her expression tense, her movements sharp. At first, people thought she was just another concerned parent. But within moments, her voice grew louder, and her frustration became impossible to ignore. She pointed toward the bus, demanding answers, her words filled with urgency. Children inside pressed their faces against the windows, trying to understand what was happening outside. Someone called the police. Minutes later, a patrol car pulled up behind the bus, its lights flashing softly against the quiet street. 2 officers stepped out, calm but alert, scanning the scene. Parents gathered at a distance, whispering, unsure whether to step forward or stay back. The bus remained still, its engine running, its doors closed. Karen kept insisting something was wrong. Her voice trembled, but she didn't step away. She told the officers they needed to look inside the bus. The driver seemed confused, shaking his head as if unsure what she meant. The children watched everything unfold, their excitement replaced with nervous curiosity. Something about the moment felt strange, as if a hidden story was waiting to be revealed. The officers exchanged a look. Slowly, one of them walked toward the bus door. The handle turned, and the door opened with a soft mechanical sound. The air shifted as silence spread across the street. Every parent, every child, every passerby seemed to pause at the same time. Inside that bus, something unexpected was waiting. And whatever it was enough to make the officer stop in his tracks, his expression changing instantly. The officer's expression shifted the moment he stepped onto the bus. What he saw inside wasn't loud or dramatic, yet it was enough to make him pause. His eyes slowly moved across the rows of seats as if he was searching for something that didn't belong. Outside, everyone waited, watching quietly. The children had fallen completely silent. Some clutched their bags tightly, while others leaned back in their seats, unsure of what was happening. The usual chatter that filled the bus every afternoon had disappeared. The air inside felt heavier, as though the moment itself was holding its breath. Even the driver looked confused, turning slightly in his seat to watch the officer carefully. The second officer followed behind. He stepped up onto the bus, scanning the space from front to back. Nothing seemed out of place at first glance. Lunch boxes rested on laps, backpacks lay on the floor, and sunlight filtered softly through the windows. Yet something had made Karen insist the police come, and now everyone was wondering if she had seen something no one else had noticed. Outside, Karen stood still, her earlier anger replaced with tense anticipation. She watched every movement, her eyes fixed on the bus door. Parents nearby began whispering to one another, speculating about what might be happening inside. Some thought it was a misunderstanding. Others felt there was more to the story than anyone realized. Inside the bus, one of the officers slowly walked down the aisle. He glanced beneath the seats, then looked toward the back. The children followed his movements with wide, curious eyes. No one spoke. No one moved. The only sound was the faint hum of the bus engine and the soft steps of the officer on the narrow aisle floor. Then he stopped. Near the middle row, something caught his attention. He bent slightly, looking closer at the area beside a seat. The second officer stepped forward, joining him. Their quiet conversation was impossible to hear from outside, but their expressions told a different story. This wasn't what they expected to find. The driver leaned back, trying to see what they were looking at. A few children turned in their seats, trying to catch a glimpse as well. The tension inside the bus grew stronger with each passing second. Outside, Karen noticed the officer's body language change. For the first time, she seemed unsure. The confidence she had shown earlier slowly faded, replaced with worry. Whatever was happening inside the bus was real now, and it was serious enough to hold everyone's full attention. The officers crouched slightly, focusing on the area that had caught their attention. One of them carefully reached down beside the seat, moving slowly, as if he didn't want to alarm the children. Every small movement felt important now. The silence inside the bus grew deeper, stretching across each row. Several children leaned forward, trying to see. Their curious eyes followed the officer's hand as he pulled something into view. It wasn't large, and it wasn't loud, yet it immediately shifted the mood inside the bus. The second officer stepped closer, his expression tightening as he studied it carefully. Outside, people began noticing the change. Parents who had been whispering fell quiet. Karen watched closely, her face tense, her arms folded tightly as she waited. Even from a distance, it was clear something had been found. The officers weren't rushing, but they weren't relaxed anymore either. Inside, the driver slowly stood up. He leaned slightly into the aisle, trying to understand what was happening. The children nearest to the middle rows turned in their seats, whispering softly to one another. No one fully understood what the officers had discovered, but everyone could feel the seriousness of the moment. The officer carefully held the item, examining it from different angles. It looked ordinary at first glance, something that could easily go unnoticed. But its placement raised questions. The second officer quietly spoke into his radio, his voice calm but steady. Whatever this was, it needed attention. The tension began to spread outside the bus. People exchanged uncertain looks. Some parents stepped a little closer, trying to get a better view. Karen shifted her weight, her earlier confidence now mixed with concern. She hadn't expected things to go this far. Inside the bus, one child finally whispered, asking what was happening. Another child shook their head, just as confused. The bus, usually filled with laughter and energy, now felt like a place frozen in time. Every small sound, every movement seemed louder than before. The officers stood slowly, still holding what they had found. They exchanged a serious glance, a silent understanding passing between them. One of them turned toward the front of the bus, preparing to step back outside. The driver stepped aside to give them space, his face filled with uncertainty. As the officer reached the door, the entire street seemed to hold its breath again. Whatever had been discovered was no longer just a question. It was something real, something that had quietly been there while the children sat just inches away. And now, everyone was waiting to find out what it meant. As the officer stepped down from the bus, the entire street seemed to lean forward in anticipation. Parents, teachers, and onlookers watched closely, trying to read his expression. He didn't speak right away. Instead, he held the item carefully in his hand, studying it once more as if confirming what it meant. The second officer followed behind him. Both of them stood beside the bus door for a moment, speaking quietly to each other. Their calm voices gave nothing away, but their serious faces told everyone this was more than just a simple misunderstanding. The air felt heavy, filled with questions no one dared to ask out loud. Karen stepped closer, her earlier anger now replaced with nervous tension. She tried to see what the officer was holding, but it was still unclear from where she stood. Parents nearby whispered, wondering what could have caused such a reaction. Some children inside the bus pressed their hands gently against the windows, watching every movement outside. The officer finally turned toward the group. He spoke calmly, asking everyone to stay back for a moment. His tone was steady, not alarming, but firm enough to make people listen. The second officer nodded and walked a few steps away, speaking quietly into his radio again. Whatever they had found needed to be handled carefully. The bus driver stepped down slowly. His face showed concern, and he asked the officer a quiet question. The officer answered with a short explanation, his voice low. The driver's expression shifted from confusion to surprise. He looked back at the bus, then at the children inside, as if realizing how close they had all been to something unexpected. Karen stood still, watching everything unfold. Her hands were no longer raised. Her voice was gone. For the first time since the moment began, she seemed unsure of what to do next. She glanced at the bus, then back at the officers, as if trying to understand whether she had done the right thing by speaking up. Parents continued to gather nearby. Some held their children's hands, while others watched from a distance. No one wanted to cause panic, but the tension was impossible to ignore. The officers remained calm, moving carefully, making sure the situation stayed under control. Inside the bus, the children stayed quiet. They didn't fully understand what was happening, but they knew something important had been discovered. The laughter that once filled the bus was gone, replaced by wide eyes and silent curiosity. And as the officers prepared to explain what they had found, the truth was about to come into the open. The officer took a slow breath before speaking, making sure his voice carried clearly without causing fear. Everyone leaned in slightly, waiting for an explanation. Parents held their children close, while others stood quietly, watching from behind. Even Karen stood still now, her expression tense and uncertain. "This could have been overlooked," the officer said calmly. His words were steady, careful, meant to inform rather than alarm. He explained that the item found inside the bus had likely been left behind earlier in the day. It wasn't something dangerous, but its presence raised important questions. It was something that didn't belong there. The crowd listened closely. Parents exchanged glances, some relieved, others still uneasy. The officer continued speaking, explaining how easily something small could go unnoticed in a busy place. The children inside the bus had been sitting just feet away from it without realizing it was there. The bus driver looked shaken. He kept replaying the day in his mind, wondering how it had ended up there. He checked the bus before each route, just like always. He followed the routine carefully. Yet somehow, this one thing had remained hidden in plain sight. Karen slowly stepped forward. Her earlier anger had completely faded now. She looked at the officer, then at the bus, and finally at the children inside. Her voice was quieter this time when she spoke, almost unsure. She explained that she had noticed something earlier when the bus arrived. Something had felt wrong, even if she couldn't explain why. The officer nodded. He didn't argue or dismiss her. Instead, he listened carefully, acknowledging that sometimes people notice details others miss. What mattered now was that it had been found before it caused confusion or worry later. Inside the bus, the children watched everything. Some whispered to each other again, slowly returning to their normal voices. The tension that had filled the bus earlier was beginning to fade. A few even smiled slightly, sensing that the situation was calming down. Parents began to relax as well. Some stepped closer, checking on their children through the windows. Others spoke quietly among themselves, relieved that nothing serious had happened. The heavy silence that once covered the street slowly lifted. The officer handed the item to his partner. They would handle it properly, making sure it was documented and taken care of. It was part of their job to ensure that every situation, no matter how small, was handled with attention. Karen stood quietly now, watching the officers work. She hadn't expected things to unfold this way. What began as a moment of interference had turned into something that caught everyone's attention. And even though the tension was fading, the memory of this moment would stay with everyone who had witnessed it. As the situation slowly settled, the street began to feel normal again. The tension that once filled the air started to fade, replaced by quiet conversations and relieved expressions. Parents loosened their grip on their children's hands, and the officers continued working calmly, making sure everything was handled properly. The bus driver stood near the door, thinking. He replayed the day in his mind, trying to understand how something so small could create such a large moment. Every morning, he followed the same routine. He checked the seats, watched the mirrors, and made sure each child was safe. Today had started no differently. Yet it ended in a way no one expected. Karen remained a few steps away, watching silently. The anger that had once filled her voice was gone. In its place was something quieter, something more reflective. She looked at the children inside the bus, then at the officers, as if trying to make sense of everything that had happened. One of the officers walked toward her. His tone was calm and respectful as he spoke. He thanked her for bringing attention to what she noticed. Even though the situation had seemed intense at first, her decision to speak up had helped them find something that could have stayed hidden longer. Karen nodded slowly. She didn't say much, but the relief in her expression was clear. She hadn't wanted to cause fear or trouble. She had simply followed a feeling that something wasn't right. Now, seeing everything under control, she seemed more at ease. Inside the bus, the children began talking again. The silence that had held them earlier was gone. Some laughed quietly, while others leaned across the aisle to whisper about what had just happened. For them, it felt like a strange moment that would become a story they might tell later. Parents started stepping closer. Some waved gently through the windows, checking that their children were okay. Others spoke to the driver, offering kind words. The sense of worry that had filled the street earlier had now turned into quiet understanding. The officers finished their notes. They spoke briefly with the driver one last time, reminding him to continue his careful routine. It wasn't about blame. It was about making sure every day remained safe for the children who trusted that bus to take them home. The patrol car lights dimmed. The moment that had drawn so much attention was slowly coming to an end. The street no longer felt tense. It felt calm again. But one final part of the story was still waiting to be revealed. The final moments of the afternoon felt quieter than anyone expected. The officers prepared to leave, their work nearly done, while the last pieces of tension faded from the street. Parents slowly stepped back, and the driver returned to his seat, ready to continue the route that had been paused. But something had changed. It wasn't just about what had been found inside the bus. It was about the feeling that had passed through everyone who stood there watching. A simple day had turned into something unexpected, reminding everyone how quickly an ordinary moment could shift into something unforgettable. The children inside the bus had started talking again. Their voices were soft at first, then slowly grew louder. Some wondered what the officers had discovered. Others talked about how quiet everything had become when the bus stopped. For them, the moment had felt big, even if they didn't fully understand why. The driver checked his mirrors again. He looked down the aisle, making sure each child was seated safely. His routine hadn't changed, but now he moved with even more care. He understood how important his role was, and how much trust every parent placed in him each day. Outside, Karen stood for one last moment. She watched the bus, her face calm now. The earlier frustration was gone. In its place was a quiet sense of reflection. She hadn't expected her actions to lead to such a scene, but deep down, she knew she had followed her instincts. One of the officers gave her a small nod. It was a simple gesture, but it carried meaning. The situation had been handled, the questions had been answered, and the day could finally move forward. The bus doors closed gently. The engine's hum grew slightly louder as the vehicle prepared to leave. Parents stepped back, waving softly as the bus began to move again. Inside, children looked out the windows, some smiling, others still thinking about what they had just witnessed. For them, it would become a story. A strange moment from an ordinary day. A memory of a bus that stopped, police arriving, and adults speaking in quiet, serious voices. Something that once felt confusing would later feel like a lesson about paying attention and looking out for one another. As the bus turned the corner and disappeared down the street, the calm returned fully. The officers drove away. Parents went back to their routines. The street looked the same as it had before. But for those who were there, the day would always stand out. Because sometimes, the smallest discoveries are the ones that remind everyone how much care, attention, and trust matter most.
If you enjoyed the, don't forget to subscribe to Karen Universe, share with your friends and drop your thoughts in the comments.